All right. So this week we're going to spend some time talking about continuing education for coaches in the CrossFit space, sort of broadly. That could be for people working with competitors, doing individual program design. That could be for people who are coaching group classes. That could just be for like motivated athletes who are interested in what's actually going on and maybe want to learn a little bit more about the ins and outs of program design or movement and all that stuff, just for their own curiosity or to potentially try to improve their performance. So, Luke and I are both continuing education junkies. That's basically how I even got into coaching in the first place, was through this process of being curious and wanting to learn more and reading stuff and watching videos online and all that. And that sort of led me down this journey of eventually being able to help other people. We have some thoughts about how continuing education is delivered to coaches, how coaches utilize continuing education, and some of the positives and negatives about ways that this material is presented to folks, right? Because we want people to actually take this material that they might learn from a seminar, that they might learn from watching some YouTube video or some clever Instagram reel or whatever, and then be able to actually apply that to help people. And the transmission of knowledge in a way that's actually applicable is a surprisingly hard problem. It's very, very difficult to get someone not only to understand some new idea, but then to be able to successfully apply that. So, Luke, I know you wanted to get into some details here, but it might be useful to just sort of talk about like your own journey with continuing education to start with.
Yeah, so I got into CrossFit when I was in like my second year at uni, and I suppose I was also doing like coaching qualifications around, because I was doing a degree in sports development. So I wasn't really trying to acquire a bunch of knowledge in particular sports or anything like that. But I've always been doing coaching courses in some sense. But then I sort of started to look into more strength and conditioning information and that type of stuff whilst I was at university and I was playing rugby. And then I sort of just came across more weightlifting and more weightlifting for sports performance and CrossFit information. And then I similar to you, that's sort of how I found it and got into it. I just had a general interest in training and the best way to train. That was definitely a forethought that I had when I got into CrossFit. And I suppose that like informed everything that I've sort of done, or all of the different paths of curiosity that I've sort of gone down. But when I did start, the first sort of courses that I did my level 1. I think I actually did my British weightlifting, and I did the old CrossFit mobility course before I did my level 1. Then I did my L1. Did my sort of British weightlifting. When I moved to the Middle East, I was quite lucky that the gym I was at, and I sort of encouraged this as well, we were a bit of a hub of the area. So I really tried to push for like the CrossFit, all of the old speciality courses to come over to Q8 where I was, and to come to that gym. So I did, strongman, endurance, rowing, gymnastics. So I did a lot of different ones then, and I, through that time, also started to intern and started to work on the CrossFit weightlifting courses. And then I got into the OPEC CCP. I think it was the OPT. It was just making that switch over. And that really opened my eyes to actually education outside of the CrossFit world. And I would say since taking my CCP and doing that, and then doing some of the modules through Training Think Tank as well, which I think you could say is a bit of, I know Max used to work for OPT, so there's some similarities there, but there's also, I would say maybe a little bit more openness to like nuance and that type of stuff, which is quite interesting. But like every single time I would like take in someone's course, usually there's a bit at the end or at the beginning where it's like, what are the influences? And I used to look at the influences or the books or the reading lists, and I used to just sort of get myself involved in those. And I've used to, download tons of ebooks and read lots of ebooks and that type of stuff, which was always quite helpful. Reading lots of different strength programs because they tend to be written by meatheads, so it's quite easily digestible. A few harder to read textbooks thrown in there every now and then. But yeah, I would say that my education has moved a lot more towards movement and biomechanics over the last 2 years, but then more so in the actual like last 12 months, I've been really going for it in this area. I've sort of been plugged into like a few different things, online sort of subscriptions and that type of stuff, and I make a point now of like, okay, I need to be hitting at least one point of education. You need to read at least a blog post a day or watch a video a day or something like that. So I try to do that, and that's actually probably one of the things I really enjoy about my work, is actually just being able to dive into that type of stuff. But yeah, I suppose over the years, and also just like I've helped a few other coaches just on sort of more of a very informal mentoring basis, and through that process, and then also through helping coaches on the CrossFit weightlifting course, and usually having a bit of a conversation and a back and forth with them on those courses. It's interesting that my view has changed quite a lot on like the information that's actually delivered. I suppose I did go through a phase maybe a couple of years ago where I was like, oh, this is way too reductionist and this is too simple and I don't agree with that. And, because I was probably engaging in information that was a little bit more dense. And, but I also, I think a lot of coaches do sort of go through this phase where they start to engage in information which is, a little bit, it's a little bit more thought out, a little bit more thorough than some of the stuff that they may have got into earlier, and then they start dismissing all of the stuff that maybe they got into. But a big part of what I've realized is you've got to make sure that the information is fairly workable. And on the CrossFit weightlifting course, we distill problems and concepts of weightlifting down to exercises, and this exercise is good for this, and this exercise is good for that. And a lot of that, I believe, isn't, and whether it's done, whether the material was made in that way or not. But a lot of the people who are coming onto the course, that's the easiest way to actually make an impact, is to actually just show them an exercise and be like, okay, we're focusing on this, this, and this, and these are some key areas that we need to develop in weightlifting. So people go away from the course and they have just a list of progressions and exercises that they can dive into in their own coaching, their own training. And then hopefully through that process, they start to understand weightlifting. They start to understand, a lot more around biomechanics and how to teach skills and how to isolate skills and that type of stuff. So I've started to become a little bit more, just a little bit more open-minded around information, education, making sure that, the stuff is fairly workable. I think that everyone goes through, a point in their learning where the easiest thing for them to actually get their head around is this exercise is good for that, and that exercise is good for this, and this training protocol and this interval structure is going to help you do this. Makes it manageable for people, gives them the tools that they can actually go out and engage in it. And then what they can do through that process is start asking those deeper questions if they start going into it a bit more. I suppose I wouldn't necessarily say it's a gripe, but what I will say is when people start to get a little bit dogmatic around certain things that they are, they've learned or that they're using, and it's like, that is the only way. Sometimes that can be, I wouldn't say it's annoying or irritating, but it's like, it's a shame sometimes that you can see that.
It's okay to say it's annoying.
Yeah, no, but I mean, it's more. Yeah, no, but like, I suppose I've fallen. I've really been into certain areas or into certain methods of my education, and then I've also seen that it can be fairly dogmatic after a while, and it's like, oh, maybe this is not as critically minded as I initially thought, and then I see a lot of the downfall in that method or that process. But then I'm also aware that like maybe that method is just targeted at a different group of people. Maybe it's targeted at a group of people who they need things a little bit more that are a little bit simpler. And I suppose now with my education, a lot of the stuff that I'm learning about biomechanics and movement it's really difficult because I don't necessarily have the same base level knowledge in anatomy and that type of stuff that you may be learning if you did, sports science or kinesiology or something like that at university. So
wait, hold on. What did you do for your degree? Wasn't it sports science?
It wasn't sports science, it was sports development. So it was more of like the, you could say, the social and educational impacts of sport. And so we were doing lots of stuff. I was doing more modules around politics and community development and youth and social work and that type of stuff than I was in actual sport.
Interesting.
So,
okay. Yeah. All right.
So yeah, I mean, so then I did do some basic science modules, but it was like super, super basic. The stuff I ended up actually enjoying more was a lot more of the, you could say the sort of the politics and that type of stuff that we were learning. But yeah, the biomechanics work can be confusing sometimes. And I get to a point where I'm like, I've actually got a seminar that I'm going to go to or a workshop I'm going to go to this weekend. And just looking over the material that we're going to cover, I'm like, okay, this is going to get difficult. And we like the bit where they're talking about assessments and that type of stuff. It's interesting because I did do I did actually do this workshop that I'm going to attend, but I did it actually this time last year, and it was with a bunch of physios, and we were going through like a movement assessment and this type of stuff that we were working on in a sort of practical setting. And I found it really difficult because these people were saying, "Oh, you can see this and that and this and that," but at the same time, I knew. And it got to a point where we were actually doing some like practical stuff where we were teaching jumping and squatting and this type of thing. And then for me, I was like, yeah, this is easy. All right, okay, I can see something's going on there. And I had to say the tools of improving someone's movement or whatever it was, but it didn't necessarily have like the very, in-depth understanding of what I was doing. But it was, I suppose it's interesting. You can, when you have that exposure to certain things, it becomes a lot easier to sort of see and identify what you're seeing. But right now I'm sort of getting into the biomechanics of the foot and the gait cycle and this type of thing, and it's like, okay, this is there's 30 odd joints in your foot. It's not just your typical ball and socket or hinge joint that you may have learned at school.
Sure, totally. Yeah, I think that you touched on a lot of really interesting stuff there. And one of the things I wanted to follow up on was this sort of interest in consuming information for information's sake, right? That, the certain corners of the internet would call that kind of person like an infovore, right? Like someone who enjoys just like eating information. I certainly have that tendency. And I think that for myself, even getting into coaching in the first place was associated with that because I started doing CrossFit and liked it. I was like, oh, okay, well, I should read these articles on the CrossFit Journal. Like, that seems like a good idea. And then sort of like you were saying, it's like, oh, okay, like this guy writing about CrossFit, seems to at least know what he's talking about. And he's referencing this guy named Mel Sith. Like, okay, maybe I should see what Mel Sith has to say. If he's influential to this person, like I might as well follow that, like trail of breadcrumbs. And so there's a certain kind of person who has that tendency that is going to be like, oh, okay, like Louis Simmons is talking about these, secret strength manuals or whatever. Like, let's see if I can download those as PDFs on the internet. Like, oh, I can. Like, great. Let me just try to read this thing, And there's that willingness and interest in like going back to the roots that I associate that with sort of my youth involved in like punk and hardcore and metal and stuff like that, where you're like, oh, okay, like this band has a thank you list and they thanked these 10 bands and I know 3 of them. Like, all right, let's write down those other 7 and like go check them out. Like, oh, this band cited this band as an influence. Okay, well, I should probably listen to them and I should probably start at their first demo and just like go from there. So it's like organizing the information, not just organizing the information that has been consumed, but organizing the information to be consumed in the future, which will then, of course, funnel into the information that you have that must also be organized, right? So that's not normal, right? That's not like a necessarily good or positive. There's a lot of negatives associated with that kind of behavior, but it is something that is potentially helpful for like understanding and contextualizing large amounts of information. And so the sort of like you're saying, I think the reality for most people is like, they're not interested in doing that, and like nor should they be. Like it's not necessarily like a good use of time to behave that way. But there is an element of like, okay, we have some percentage of people who are this like, oh, I want to know just for the sake of knowing. But that's not the norm, right? That most coaches are interested in like, I have specific problems that I see with my athletes who I'm working with, or I have specific issues that I see in this class when I try to coach it, or I myself struggle with this movement and I don't really understand why. Like I can tell that it's not quite right, but I watch my video, it doesn't look right, but like, what do I do? And to your point, right, it might be a little reductionist to be like, oh, well, what you need to do for that is muscle snatches. Like muscle snatches help with turnover, and your turnover isn't good, so therefore do a muscle snatch, right? Okay, that's like a simple algorithm that like maybe isn't exactly correct, but that at least is like, I have a problem. I perceive my problem to be turnover in the snatch. You have a solution, which is do muscle snatches. Like, okay, we have this like, there's a match there. Problem, solution. Let me try it. And then, like you said, maybe through the process of trying this, I will then learn and contextualize some information about muscle snatches, learn and contextualize some information about turnover. And then maybe I have a more nuanced understanding of how this movement works and what things I might do to try to work on it, that then I can add new information or tactics to. Right. But if I don't have this just like desire to consume information for information's sake, and I don't have like a super nuanced picture of what the problem even is, like you giving me a bunch of detail and extraneous information and like context that I perceive as irrelevant, like doesn't help me. Like, listen, my problem is turnover on the snatch. What is my solution? And you're like, oh, well, like it depends, like XYZ, ABC, like maybe you have like this foot mechanics issue. And you're like, dude, what are you talking about? Like, what is the solution to turnover on the snatch? Like, help me out here. And you're like, muscle snatches. It's like, okay, cool. Like I can do a muscle snatch. Thank you. Like, let me try that and move on. So yeah, it's this, it's a trade-off there in terms of like giving people enough information to help them, but not, trying to like change too many of their beliefs at once, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no. I definitely think it's important, right? It's quite funny. You were talking about the hoarding information for the future. I have like an unbelievable amount of programs that I just have as like Evernote documents that I just never read. But then I might every now and then, like every 6 months, just be combing through my Evernote and I actually find one of the programs or the articles or something like that. And I'm like, I read it, and it's sometimes quite interesting. It's like, oh, this is quite cool. This is something I obviously downloaded or, got from the internet at some stage of where my head was at. And it's quite good to actually reflect back on it. And I always notice it's usually is like constantly this cycle of like diving into something deep and then come out of it and just drawing what you can, make it simple, and then going into something else that's a bit deeper and just sort of constantly trying to like pull out the usable information. But yeah, going back to what you were saying about trying to maybe like deliver a certain message without actually just changing someone's mind completely. Like I had a video and I tried to put out a post every single day. And a big part of that is actually just like learning how
Where do you do your posts?
Do them on Instagram. But yeah.
How do I find you on Instagram? How do I follow this insightful man?
You just go on the bottom and where that search bar is, you just put in LJ, and most likely you're going to see LJ Holmes. Click on that and you're going to have a post a day. Not on the weekend though. But anyway, so anyway, big part of that is like, okay, I have all of this information I'm consuming. This is really interesting for me. Maybe some of this information is helpful. I'm not too sure. I do know the stuff that is helpful. Usually it's the stuff that's popular or the stuff that gets engagement. Usually it's the stuff where I'm talking less. It's a little bit flashier. It's a very simple. It's usually 3 things of something. I don't know. But it's that type of content. But anyway, so I'm trying to get some useful information out there, try to offer a bit of a different perspective, try to give people some of the stuff that I'm actually engaging with. and that I've actually seen to be useful in my own coaching. And I put out a post the other day, and I think it was, so I was talking about basically the ability to push into the floor, the ability to create downward force, and that pronating your feet and creating sort of internal rotation is an important part of that, which I think for a lot of people, they don't really understand. I think a lot of people there's a lot of people still trying to do this whole knees out thing throughout the whole of life. And I suppose I see it a lot in weightlifting where like everyone's trying to, die and foo the hell out of their first pull and then can continue with that knees out position like all the way through their lifting because they see it or they think that they see a certain thing. And anyway, and I try to sort of get this idea of like, hey, get your knees out the way, but you need to do this fancy thing called pronation at the foot, and for you to do that, let the knees do what they're going to do, and that means let those knees drift in once the bar passes the knee. So it's trying to like, I suppose, give people the information that they want, which is, this is going to help your lifting, this is going to solve this problem. But at the same time, trying to drip feed maybe little bits of the information which might be a little bit more useful for them, might change their perspective and be like, oh, that actually makes sense. Rather than someone just sort of coming barreling in like, I'm trying to think of someone who, like CrossFit sort of did it a little bit, I suppose, Greg, with a lot of the initial information he was putting out there, he was just trying to like completely change everyone's perspective. Another person who reminds me of that is Julian Pinot, right? A lot of the information he puts out there is some useful stuff for sure, but he has this sort of saying of like, burn the questions and, go down the rabbit hole, and everything is about like clearing your mind. But sometimes when you engage in all of that new information, it's like, where the hell do you start? So I think it's, if you are like, if you're an educator or whatever it is, you have to sort of have this play with giving people what they need, but at the same time, trying to speak to them or speak directly to their problem. Also, I think a big part of it as well is getting people to join the dots themselves and actually come to the conclusions themselves, rather than, you read this thing on, a blog post, so now you have to go and that's how you think from now on. It's like, no, it doesn't really work like that. But what you can do is you can actually just sort of encourage this bit of a deeper thought process around it, and hopefully that will come around and allow people to become a little bit more informed as they go through it.
Yeah, right. It's like your ability to change someone else's mental model of whatever the problem that they're experiencing. We can stick with weightlifting technique, right? The ability of a coach to go in there and actually change that model of like, how should weightlifting technique work be done? What is my specific problem on my lift? What is the problem of my athlete who I'm trying to coach? That's limited. It's pretty limited to actually go inside someone's head and like adjust, like maybe tune the weights on different synapses. Like, okay, we need to like totally change your perception of how this even works. Like that's just not going to happen. You can sort of, like you're saying, provide some additional context, some additional information to help maybe clarify something like knees out, right? People may have this idea of knees out, like, okay, knees out is important. I need to get external rotation. It creates torque in the hip. This is something that people are yelling all the time, like knees out is good. And, okay, like, can I go in there and sort of, like I was saying, start tuning synapses? Like, okay, we need to like add more subtlety and nuance surrounding knees out. Like, no, that's not going to happen. But to your point, that nugget of information delivered at the right time of like, hey, here's why you might want to have your knees out. Here's why you might see it in these hook grip videos. Here's situations in which it's helpful. But, the messaging that you may be internalizing from some of this stuff is like not fully accurate. And here's a slightly different way of looking at it. That if you think about like the landscape of this mental model of weightlifting technique, like maybe we just sort of like added a little, nook or cranny into this blob, and you're like, here's a little bit that's slightly different. And I think that's the most that you can actually hope for. That these sort of like large paradigm shifting transitions are probably not realistic. But as a coach who does have that sort of like infovore tendency to really want to understand just for understanding's sake, and then communicate that to other people, which I think is admirable. That's I guess just like the the culmination of that collecting of information is like, okay, now I have this, and can I give it to you in a way that actually lands for you and makes sense, rather than just like vomiting a bunch of stuff at you or like criticizing you or I don't know, just kind of like being generally miscalibrated about like info dumping on people.
Has has your, like, going back to school and going back to studying, and I know it's something completely different, but have you been able to draw out anything from your learning there that's been helpful for your coaching, or helpful for you actually helping the coaches at South Loop or anything like that?
Interesting. Yeah, just for context, I know some people listening are probably aware of this, other folks are not, since we do talk about it sometimes. Yeah, I just completed a master's degree in computer science with a focus on machine learning. And yeah, the like formal academic environment, I actually think had less instruction than I would have expected, if that makes sense. I think of the academic environment that I was in as much more like some of the just like brutal like competitive quote unquote training camps that we talk about, where it's like, okay, you have like a pretty robust selection process to even let people in here, then you give them something really really hard to do in a way where they're competing with each other, and they just like sort themselves out. So there was far less like actual teaching than I would have anticipated, right? Not to say that my professors weren't good. Some of them were amazing, right? They did a really good job of lecturing. If you came to them with questions, they were often very helpful. If you utilized office hours between the professors and the TAs, I think some of the best learning actually came from that, because then you could sort of like explain your understanding of something and be like, do I have this correct? Like A, B, C, X, Y, Z. And they'd be like, oh, actually, no, it's like A, B, C, D, E, F. And you're like, oh, okay, like cool, that helps, right? But it's sort of incumbent upon you as a student to go in and be like, hey, here's my model of what's happening. Can you correct this, or can you help me understand this? And I think that a lot of the stuff too, especially in like difficult quantitative classes, is not just a conceptual understanding of the material, but sort of like tactical ticks and trips for like, sorry, trip, you know what I'm saying. You understand, right? But this is sort of like tactics of being able to parse what kind of problem you're dealing with, and then use the correct technique to actually work with that, right? And so, yeah, I don't know if there's a clear analogy to that, and like, I guess there is, right? Because as a coach, you may have a good conceptual understanding of like energy systems training or like certain biomechanics things or whatever. But then sort of like you were saying, jumping back to that physio seminar that you were involved in, where it's like doing some sort of like test and assessment thing. You're like, my experience with doing this is much lower than the people around me. And it just like, I'm not seeing the nuance or the subtlety that they're seeing as we're doing this assessment. Like it's opaque to me. Like, yeah, I mean, I don't know. The hip looked good, I guess. Like, I'm not really sure, right? And then as soon as someone is doing a more athletic movement, where you have a bunch of repetitions of like watching and assessing that movement, like you have this entire like toolkit that like a whole cognitive toolkit that you may not be consciously aware of, where it just makes sense to you. You just see it. You're like, oh yeah, like I see what's happening here. And maybe the physios have less of that cognitive toolkit, but it's much more applied to like, okay, I'm like, holding down your pelvis and like pulling your leg back. And I'm like, oh yeah, like, don't you see here? And to you as a coach who doesn't, hold people's pelvises and pull their leg back, you're like, no, man, like, I don't get it. But then as soon as they're like squatting, you're like, oh yeah, like I immediately can sort of pattern match here. So kind of like a non-answer, I suppose. But yeah, it's something that I was surprised by. I expected there to be much more like specific education and like coaching almost in an academic environment, sort of like we do in a CrossFit class, where it's like, I see you trying to snatch this way, but maybe you should try it that way instead. It just didn't really happen. It was just like, here's your homework assignment. It's really hard. Hope you finish it. And then you get a grade. And it's like, either you did it or you didn't. there wasn't a lot of like help, if that makes sense.
We should just, people should just try that with CrossFit and just see if the people's ability to self-organize, do they figure out how to snatch the bar? Like, here you go, guys. This is the goal. Get this thing overhead, one motion. Go for it. See what happens.
Well, and I mean, that's what I was saying too, where it's like, if you have some sort of admissions process, like the admissions process is just like, can I sort of filter out everyone who I don't think will be able to self-organize in this environment? Right. And so you could imagine like a CrossFit gym sort of doing something like that, where like, we'll only let you in if you have, some sort of prestigious experience with physical activity in the past, or if there was some sort of, I don't know, like equivalent of a standardized test for physical ability. And you're like, oh, you're in this percentile of proprioception and being able to like figure out movements. Like, cool, here you go. Snatch this much weight, like figure it out. It's like some percentage of those people will, they'll just learn it. Okay, fine.
Yeah. No, because so I put up it's funny you say that, because I think that is what, when you have these sort of pockets of people who are very competitive and they're in a gym and there's a lot of competitors around there, like, thinking of places like Invictus, Training Think Tank. Over here in Europe, you've got JST up in the north, in the UK. So you have these sort of hubs where basically, you have this grueling sort of admissions process for these people to actually go there, and then they're put in this competitive situation, and the you could say just the trial and error learning experience for these individuals is just huge. It's just exponential compared to someone who might be doing the best remote individual program, individualized thing in a gym where they don't actually have any of that, right? Like, this is the thing I've got to do. And I suppose it's just trying to find, you've got to, I suppose with coaching, I realize sometimes when I'm coaching people, I actually have to teach them about something sort of conceptually for them to be able to understand it and be able to practice it in their training, right? I have to make a Loom video and see this here, do this, do this. But then those people who are in those areas where, like I said, like you were saying, right, the admissions processes are really, really hard, and they're just thrown down every single day. They're doing, 3 really hard metcons that someone would only dream of doing once per week. That process in itself is a very, very quick way of learning, and learning by fire, right? So yeah, I don't know if there's nothing tangible coming from this podcast, is there?
It's fine. We're just violating all of the tenets of learning that we talked about, where it's like, rather than answering specific questions and like helping people with a specific problem that they know they have, just sort of talk abstractly in generalities and theories about what might be going on. So we'll leave that as the takeaway. Yeah, we'll leave that as the takeaway.